Good evening, everybody. My name is Race McCrae. I am the Human Relations Manager for the City of High Point. And we are officially recording and starting our meeting. So this is also going to be streamed on the city's YouTube account, archived for future purposes. Sorry, I'm getting a call real quick, but I believe it's from Councilman Johnson. Let me see about that. Hello, Human Relations. All right, sorry for that delay. That was someone trying to join the meeting, so I figured I should help them out. So as I was saying, my name is Race McCrae. I'm the Human Relations Manager for the City of High Point. That means that one of my jobs is to serve as the staff member kind of helping to coordinate the Human Relations Commission. This year, earlier in January, the Human Relations Commission chose to include exploring the feasibility of High Point becoming a fair housing assistance program on their 2021 work plan. So that was included as an item that was presented to council, and council approved that work plan item as something that they thought was of value for us to explore. So the staff has been putting together this workshop series at the behest of commission and council, so that we could explore that thoroughly. You've all been invited as our guests. We have representatives from the High Point Realtors Association. Thank you for joining us. We have representatives potentially from City Council. We have a subcommittee from our Human Relations Commission who is joining us. And we also have a number of community leaders from other organizations. You've all been brought together so that we have a wide variety of perspectives. We are approaching this as truly as an exploration. So each step along the way, we're going to be learning together new things about what this would look like and how this could work in High Point. And ultimately that will be brought to the subcommittee here. We'll bring their findings to the full Human Relations Commission, who will discuss it, potentially starting as early as their August 12th meeting. At that point, the Human Relations Commission would vote on whether or not to recommend that we become a fair housing assistance program or not. And that could happen as early as that August 12th meeting, or it could be delayed if they need further information or want further discussion. And then that recommendation would be brought to City Council. And so that's kind of the process as it's laid out. That's the part of the series that you're a part of. As such, those of you who are participants who have been agreed to be part of the core subcommittee, it is your opportunity to answer any questions that you may have, get answered today. Any concerns that you may have, any comments you want to be made, those will be considered part of the official record. So this will be included in this video as well. Each day we are going to, the next day, in the next day or two, we will be writing up these responses, these presentations, all into a summary document that we will be sharing with you, including the archive link on our YouTube, so that if there's anything you missed today, you can follow back, but this is your time to interact. We will, especially I will be watching the chat for any kind of questions you might have. Members of the subcommittee, if there's something you need immediate clarification, feel free to unmute yourself, ask questions of the presenter. If it's something that can wait, we will be pausing every few slides or so to ask questions and specifically invite questions. And I will be watching the chat from anyone who's an attendee at all. And feel free to submit your questions there. We will try to get everything answered. If tomorrow you come up with a question that you wish you would have asked, please email me. My name is Race McCrae, and my email is race.mccrae@highpointnc.gov. Any questions that you ask at that point will be answered as effectively as we can. And that would be the same, any questions asked during tonight's presentation. If we don't have an answer, we will research it and get an answer for you. And any questions like that will then be read into the record at a future meeting. So that's the process that we're going to be going to. So for tonight, I'm going to be introducing Jelani Biggs. Jelani Biggs is a City of High Point employee. He brings us a wealth of experience, though. He is currently our DEI officer for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he previously worked at a fair housing assistance program in Winston-Salem as an investigator. So he brings us a wealth of knowledge about that. Tonight is going to be talking about the certification process and kind of an overview of what a FHAP agency does. So this is going to be kind of providing a foundation. I know all of you have a familiarity with what fair housing is, and some of you may have a familiarity with FHAP agencies as well, but he's going to be talking about what would it take for a city to become a FHAP agency, and then once a FHAP agency exists, what will that look like? This will be built upon in later sessions. So the next section, I will be presenting a history of fair housing. So we'll be looking at previous ordinances that we've passed, previous discussions that have taken place with City Council, with High Point Human Relations Commission, things like that, so that you have a clearer sense of the trajectory that brought us here. The third meeting will be bringing a lawyer from a FHAP agency who will be able to talk more about the legal aspects and how that works. So those will be building directly on what Jelani's talking about. And our final session will be with a couple different fair housing investigators, one from Winston and one from Greensboro. And they're going to be talking about their experiences as investigators, and they'll be kind of, again, elaborating on some of that. So you can kind of keep that in mind as you're starting to think, what do the questions you might have? You can see how it might fit in that structure. Feel free to ask them at any time, though. If we do know that a question is going to be answered, say, by the lawyer who's coming in our third session, we might say we're going to delay that to get an expert opinion. We don't want to pontificate about something that we're not fully familiar with, but we will keep track of any questions that go unanswered so that they are fully answered in later questions. If you have any questions about this process, feel free to put them in the chat or express them now. And also, I am watching for hands raised. So if you do want to, through Zoom, raise your hand, I'll be trying to pay attention to that and make sure that everyone gets called on as necessary. So without any other delay, then I don't see any other questions. Mr. Biggs, please take it away.
Well, thanks, Race. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Pull up the presentation. Okay. Can everyone see that? What's good? We see FHAP certification process on the screen?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction, Race. As he mentioned, I'm currently the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the City of High Point. In a previous life, before I joined the city, I was with the City of Winston-Salem in their Human Relations Department. In that office, I served as a fair housing investigator, landlord-tenant mediator, and we also did quite a bit of training for residents and housing providers as well. So what's the FHAP certification process? What does that look like? As Race mentioned, this presentation is meant to kind of get us started, a baseline of what a FHAP is, and touch on some of the concepts that we'll be doing a deep dive on later on in some of the future information sessions. So here's an overview of some of the things that we'll be covering today. So our Fair Housing Ordinance. The ordinance is kind of the catalyst for getting this process started. You won't get certified unless your elected body adopts a fair housing ordinance first, and we'll touch on that a bit. And then the FHAP certification process, there's a two-phase process that you go through to get certified. Then we'll look at the responsibilities of FHAP, the case processing. What does an investigation look like? We'll touch on some of those key components. As Race mentioned, we will have a deep dive in our third session on legal review, but we'll touch a bit on that today. And then we'll recap at the end with just some key milestones that you want to be looking out for in this process. So what's the purpose of a FHAP, or a Fair Housing Assistance Program? It's a local agency that administers fair housing law. And that law has been determined, will be determined to be substantially equivalent by HUD. HUD provides a local agency, once certified, with grant funding to administer that. So what we're really talking about is access and administering the law in a local setting. As many of you know, the State Human Relations Commission currently handles some of these investigations, but we're talking about accessibility at the local level. So the Fair Housing Ordinance, as I mentioned before, is the doorway by which you go through the certification process. This process assumes that your local body drafts and eventually adopts an ordinance that has been deemed substantially equivalent to the Federal Fair Housing Act by HUD. In order for that to happen, it needs to have at a minimum the same level of protections as that of the Federal Fair Housing Act, meaning that it has the same protected classes, it covers the same type of transactions, but it can have more. If you do a little research, you'll see that some localities have an ordinance that has additional protected classes. I think it's DC, Washington, DC, that has 19 protected classes. So you can definitely add more protections and protected classes. However, it can't have any less than the Federal Fair Housing Act. So here's that two-phase process that we're talking about. In your first phase, HUD wants to see that your law, that ordinance on its face, is substantially equivalent. Again, offering the same protections. If they deem it so, then you go into an interim certification process. We'll talk about that a little more, where HUD is auditing you on an annual basis, and that lasts for a 3-year period. Even once you're out of the interim period, you're still audited on an annual basis. But HUD is looking at this 3-year window to see in the second phase if in operation you can administer the law correctly, and they're assessing you for your case process and quality. So again, your local ordinance must at a minimum have the same protections, same protected classes as the Federal Fair Housing Act. But of course, at the discretion of your local body, elected body, you can have additional protected classes and protections. So I do want to stop there before we go into responsibilities of a FHAP agency. Race, I can't see the chat on my end, but I didn't know if anyone had any questions about those initial slides before we get into a little more detail.
I do not see any questions yet. Anyone with their camera on want to raise their hand or anything? Looks like everybody's satisfied that I can see, and I don't see any questions in the chat yet.
Awesome, sounds good. Okay. So again, much like the title suggests, an assistance program, you're a local agency investigating complaints that otherwise would be investigated by HUD. So these partnerships exist across the country. Many folks don't know that a majority of these fair housing complaints nationally are handled by local agencies. HUD navigates what cases they'll take with those local agencies. Some of them are more complex. Some of them have First Amendment implications that they'll take on. But the everyday interactions with folks, the ones walking through the door, majority of those are handled by some of these local fair housing assistance programs. So again, the only thing that I want to key on this slide is that, you know, becoming a FHAP agency isn't just about investigations. In my time in the city of Winston-Salem, I spent a good bit of time doing education and outreach and training. And Race can tell you this, that functionality exists now. The difference is that HUD would be giving you resources and funding to do that. And so you would see it almost supercharged once you receive grant funding in the education, outreach, and training portion, because again, that's an expectation from HUD that those annual audits, you can show that you affirmatively reached out to housing providers. That includes management companies, realtors, in addition to tenants and other residents, to make sure they're well informed of the fair housing laws. So this is complaint processing. And again, I won't get into too much detail here. This is just kind of to get you thinking about some of these concepts. At some future work sessions, we'll be doing a deep dive specifically here with some other fair housing investigators. But you have some major checkpoints in any fair housing case. The first being intake. So that's when a fact pattern walks through the door and you have someone that comes in and wants to talk to you about a fair housing issue. You know, that intake phase is very important, because what you want to make sure is this is actually a complaint that is covered by the Fair Housing Act. As Race will tell you in his duties in the Human Relations Office, a good portion of folks that come in have a mixed bag of issues that we're helping sift through and get them in the right direction. You can have a landlord-tenant issue. You can have a minimum housing code issue. You can have just a housing security issue or housing placement issue, in addition to a fair housing issue. So a lot of times what we have to do is sift through the articulated issues that the customer may have and make sure they get pointed in the right direction. The next bullet point you see, investigative plan development. That's when an investigator, you know, assuming that this is a fair housing complaint, a proper complaint that is covered by the law, you begin to develop a plan for how you're going to investigate the allegations. This is all done in conjunction with legal. So in this process, when you're a FHAP agency, it's mandated by HUD that you're working with your legal department throughout the investigative process to keep them apprised of where you stand. There should never be, at the end of a potentially 100-day investigation, that your legal department is surprised by the direction that you've headed in. And you want to get some other eyes on it and make sure that it's headed in the right direction. And then you see investigation and conciliation. A really key component within complaint processing or case processing is the conciliation process. There of the fair housing complaints that come through the doors of a FHAP, a good portion of those are conciliated. That's HUD's way of just saying that they're settled. There's an agreement to terms between the parties. What HUD wants to see in any investigative file or when they're monitoring you online is that you're proactively talking to the parties about conciliation. Again, assuming that this is a fair housing complaint that you've accepted, that you've pushed forward, you want to make sure that throughout that process, from literally day one to the last day of the investigation, that you're ensuring that you're talking to both parties about, okay, are there terms that we can agree to bring this issue to a close? In many cases, we found that that's in the best interest of both parties. You'll see neutral fact finding there. It is very important that, and mandated by HUD, that investigators remain neutral throughout the process. I see a hand raised there, raised by Amy. I didn't know if.
I did, thank you. This is just a, I guess how it works process question. But your legal team, is that specifically just like the city attorney, or is there like someone who specializes in fair housing that's going to be in the building? Like you're going to hire I guess I'm just wondering if your legal team is the city attorney or if you're going to have a subject matter expert like a fair housing attorney on staff.
Yeah, sure. So that's a great question, Amy. And I'll use Winston-Salem as an example. The city attorney's office will be the main resource when it comes to legal advice on these fair housing complaints. The attorney that's assigned that as their primary function, in most cases, receive the exact same training as the fair housing investigators. So in Winston-Salem, Takesha Red, who will be part of one of our information sessions at a later date, she received fair housing training just as the investigators did. So that's a really great question. We usually will be going to on-staff attorneys for information. However, there are regional resources as well, but those attorneys are given training just like the investigators.
Thank you.
And I can jump in, Amy, as well. One of the things that we talk about during this process is that not everything is mandated by HUD, that it has to be a certain way. So some of this would also be how it would be set up in whatever ordinance the city would be drafting. So it is not our purview, especially as a commission, to determine how the city attorney's office should handle their staffing. That's what I'd say. So while that's true, I just want to make clear that they will be making that determination about what does it mean an additional staff member, or does it mean some other thing.
Thanks, Grace. So this is a continuation of the conciliation concept. An investigator, there's supposed to be a wall, if you can imagine that, between the investigation and the conciliation process. It's actually mandated by HUD that if during the conciliation process, where parties are negotiating on terms, that some additional piece of evidence comes out in that process that is not then used as part of the investigative piece, there's an understanding that that may undermine the process. So HUD is very clear that if that evidence hadn't been already gathered in the investigative process, in the spirit of conciliation, you wouldn't disclose that. It wouldn't be included in any final determination. And then we go to the determination recommendation portion of the process. Now, if for some reason the case is not conciliated and you make it to the end of the investigation, the investigator is going to make a recommendation for the disposition of that determination. Cause meaning it is their recommendation that there was sufficient evidence to say discrimination occurred, and no cause meaning that there was not. Again, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Throughout the investigative process, as I mentioned, from the intake to the development of the investigative plan, all the way up to arriving at a determination, your legal representation or your legal staff should be helping you arrive at that place so they're not surprised by your final determination. And it's also no secret that most of these cases end with conciliation, meaning they agreed on terms, or a no cause finding. And then if you do have a cause finding, you then go into determination review with your legal team. So this is an ongoing dialogue. And as I tell folks, this process is built to have numerous off-ramps for parties throughout the process. So there's also post-cause conciliation. So you've got conciliation that occurs during the investigative process. Let's say a determination is made that there's evidence of discrimination, but there's going to be another crack at conciliation again after that determination is made. And one thing I failed to mention earlier on when I got into the case processing portion, this process is meant to be transparent. In my years as an investigator in Winston-Salem, it wasn't uncommon for a resident, housing provider or a tenant to come in, sit down with me and say, where do we stand right now? What's the status of this? Can we talk about a certain aspect of the investigation? And it was expected of me to be available and fully able to talk about the status of any investigation with the parties, of course, throughout the course of the process. So it's not that, you receive a letter on day one and maybe on day 100, you receive a final disposition. There should be constant contact with the parties throughout this. There should be no surprises at the end of this process.
Mr. Biggs, just to pause for a question real quick. We had a question from Mr. Cordobo. How many fair housing intakes did High Point process? Well, it says High Point Human Relations process in 2020. Do you have that number off the top of your head?
I think what we gave to the number we gave to City Council, and correct me if I'm wrong, Grace, was 20 complaints. Just to put context on that, HUD has stated in previous guidance, and guidance can always change, but in my years with the city of Winston-Salem, which has a population of around 250,000 folks, that their minimum expectation was 8 fair housing cases per year. So, numbers matter within context. And so that kind of gives you an idea of how many cases would be expected of an operation going in. So with a population of our size, it would be in that 8 number as well. We will fall within that range. And so in 2020, in that span of time, we referred about 20 cases to the State Human Relations Commission. Now, just by way of our structure, we assess those complaints when they come in, just as I described. We look for, okay, are they alleging that they were discriminated against based on a protected class? Does it sound like this is a covered respondent? Does it sound like this would be a covered dwelling? And we will refer that to the state. What we can't do is speak for the state's intake process. However, we did send them about 20 fair housing cases in that span of time.
And just to clarify, I looked it up, what we presented. Those were 20 cases that were slightly over more than a year. So it was not just 20 per year. That was starting from November 2019 to the time that we presented this, which I believe was April or May. So that was roughly 18 months. So there was a little more than 1 per month that we had referred. And to give you just some context on that, and you can go back and see this also when we presented this to City Council earlier. That included 10 that were in the protected class of disability, 2 that were in the protected class of familial status, 2 that were in the protected class of sex or gender, 3 that were in the protected class of race, and 3 that were in the protected class of undisclosed. And to give you the context of what that means, and I know Mr. Biggs was probably going to elaborate on that our current process, because we are not a FHAP, we submit cases, we refer cases to the FHAP of the North Carolina Human Relations Commission. So what that means is that we do not get any follow-up. Once we turn it over to investigators, or to the intake team, they do that entirely themselves. They don't provide us any kind of notes about how it was conciliated or not, whether it went to trial, whether it was cause or no cause. That could be something that they, took all the way to federal court, or it could be something that they did a preliminary investigation and found that there was no concern. However, that number is also just what's coming into our office. Because they don't even let us know about our own cases, it shouldn't be a surprise that they also would not tell us if there were cases that were immediately taken right to the NCHRC or submitted to HUD itself. And HUD in those cases, because North Carolina is covered by this, by the NCHRC, HUD would then send those to the NCHRC. So we have no idea if our town is generating 20 cases over those 18 months or 75 cases or more. And we don't even know that those ultimately turn into cases. But as Mr. Biggs was saying, those kind of are considered, for the context of Winston-Salem, the expectation would be that they would be investigating 8 per year. So 20, assuming they all became cases, is high for that, is above that number. There's no high or low. It would be above that number of what HUD would be expecting. But if, we would have no way of evaluating if that's all they took on or what they did with those cases. Does that make sense?
And thank you, Race. And what I'll say, just in my experience, is that the 8 number of cases for Winston-Salem, we exceeded that most years. I mean, we went far and beyond that most years, but I think HUD is trying to just get some guidance on what would be expected based on population range. But as Ray stated, assessing how much need is out there is a bit difficult when you're just looking at who's walking into your office versus, who may be going directly to the State Human Relations Commission or HUD for that matter.
And we did have just a quick clarification follow-up that someone did also ask, what do I mean by NCHRC? So that is the North Carolina Human Relations Commission. So that is the state level FHAP. So there are multiple levels of how fair housing is administered for the whole United States. Since it is a federal law, it is administered by HUD, and specifically what is the specific office, Chilani? Do you remember?
FHEO.
FHEO. And so that's Fair Housing and Employment Office. And so that is covering every single state in America. And then on a slightly smaller level, FHAPs do not have to be cities, they can be states. So in this case, North Carolina is a state that has a FHAP. And we are then therefore all of our state is covered by the North Carolina Human Relations Commission. And the North Carolina Human Relations Commission then, if any cities themselves wish to become FHAPs, that then they would be taking those cases and you'd be passing on to local cases and local investigators. So there are a number of cities in North Carolina that have chosen to become FHAPs instead of being administered by the state level FHAP. So that would be, for example, and I don't know that I'm going to name them all, but Charlotte, Greensboro, Winston-Salem are good examples. And so any fair housing case that originates in Greensboro would be handled by the local investigator. But any fair housing case that that originates in Boone, because they do not have a FHAP, would be investigated by the North Carolina Human Relations Commission. And then I'm making up an imaginary example, but anyone that happens in Nevada, I do not believe they have a state level FHAP. So that would actually be investigated at the federal level by the FHEO. And I think that kind of covers that answer. And to clarify, someone asked about the number November 2019 to May 2020. Was that the 20 cases in that date? Yes, it was November 2019 to May 2020. That was the 20 cases that we had, that we made referrals to NCHRC. And Mr. Crittlebaugh also asked, since there is an NC agency to deal with this, what is the advantage of having a local FHAP agency? And Mr. Biggs, I'll refer that to you.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about is accessibility to a service. If you speak with the folks with the North Carolina Human Relations Commission, they do great work. I mean, they're covering the entire state. So of the FHAP agencies that Ray's listed, you got Winston-Salem, Charlotte, Greensboro, Orange County, and Durham, I believe. I think I covered them all. Outside of that, every other locality the state has to cover. So if you have a fair housing case that arises in Nashville, and then the next day you get one from Wilmington, some of these, especially in these disability cases where you have a reasonable modification complaint, or even accommodation required site visits. So that investigator would be covering that area. So this, much like many of the other city services that we offer, is about accessibility to a service, not only for tenants, but also housing providers. The local relationships that we shared in the city of Winston-Salem were robust with the training and education and outreach with some of the local housing providers there. So I think there's this that isn't creating necessarily new law or a new service. It's just about accessibility to getting some of those issues addressed.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions at the moment.
I may have. And so this is just touching on this. And again, we will circle back to this in more detail once we get to the legal information session. But should a complaint not take any of those offerings that we spoke about before in the forms of conciliation or no cause, and this is something that could be pushed forward for legal action, there is a space where HUD, if they see that that's necessary, taking some court action, will provide an agency with special litigation funds. So this is just a recap. When you're looking at complaint processing, you're talking about intake. Okay, when they come in, is this a covered protected class? Is this a covered dwelling, a covered transaction? The investigation process, which is supposed to be fully transparent to all parties involved. We're going from beginning to end. Determination, that's the final disposition of a case, and then your legal review process. And so this is just a summary of what FHAP is and what it's not. So it's just a local pathway, as we mentioned earlier, to an accessible housing resource. These are HUD certified trainers and investigators that are accessible to your local residents, accessible to your local housing providers. One of the things I used to do as an investigator in Winston-Salem is I would encourage, if we had a training with a housing provider, I would encourage all the attendees to call me. Call me with questions. Call me with real world questions that you have when a resident walks in. One of the things that I noticed, especially on some of the more complicated cases that involve a reasonable modification request, with the increase in awareness of some cognitive disabilities, I'm sure some of our housing providers have seen an uptick in reasonable accommodation requests as well, to call us. It wasn't uncommon for some housing providers in Winston to say, hey, Jelani, I had someone come in yesterday with this fact pattern. Is there any advice you can give me on this situation? And we would be as helpful as we possibly could. In some cases, we would actually reach out to our contacts at HUD to try to get you an answer. So many of these, or some of these violations, are not due to nefarious intent. These are complicated issues, and sometimes folks may give an incorrect answer, just not knowing how to navigate a situation. So what it is not, it's not a advocacy organization, and it's not a federal agency that doesn't really hone in on some local nuanced issues. The FHAP is supposed to kind of weave itself into the fabric of the community and be responsive to those needs. So if there are any unique concerns amongst housing providers or residents, the FHAP is supposed to be responsive to that. And these are just key milestones. This is just a recap of what we were talking about before, where the catalyst for this process is adopting a fair housing ordinance. At all the detail that Race and I just gave, in order to even start this process, you have to draft and adopt a fair housing ordinance. HUD would then review that ordinance to deem it substantially equivalent. So they're going to go line by line to determine if it's a law that they deem substantially equivalent, and thereby kind of giving you a doorway into that certification process. You then, if deemed appropriate, will go into a 3-year interim certification, where HUD will be assessing you annually to see if in operation you're processing these complaints correctly. You are doing some of the things that I mentioned in education and outreach and providing training. During that audit, HUD is very intentional about wanting to know exactly how many trainings you gave, who did you train, how many attendees were there. So it's definitely a motivating factor for that FHAP agency to be an educational resource as well. And then you see there, every 24 months, you have an on-site audit where they actually physically come to your agency and do a more detailed audit. And then you're up for recertification every 5 years. That's after the interim. Assuming you exit the interim phase, you move into full FHAP status every 5 years. You're up for recertification. Having been part of that recertification process, that's when HUD comes in and looks at everything. They want to look at how you store cases, your intake process. They do interviews with all the FHAP staff. They do interviews with folks that are not even in the FHAP, but are within the municipality. So it's a very detailed process. And we want to open this up to any questions you may have at this point.
I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment. We'll give folks a little time if anyone wants to do that, and I don't see any hands up. While I'm giving folks a moment, I did want to just circle back to Mr. Criddlebow's comment or question about what's the advantage. HUD specifically states on their website that the advantages that they see are that local complaint processing under the substantially equivalent law. So again, they're highlighting that access for everyone involved. This for complainants helps overcome barriers. We know, for example, in our city that not everyone has internet access, for example, or maybe even cell phone access. So that would be an example. But it also goes the other way as well. Landlords and realtors and everyone else who's offering housing, just as Mr. Biggs said, you have the ability to walk into our office. You have the ability to develop a relationship. And in fact, that's the second advantage that they really address, is that opportunities for partnership that affirmatively further fair housing. So it really gives you access to locally trained experts. So I think that that's one of the things that we don't talk about as much, is that, for example, my office already helps refer cases to the NC Human Relations Commission. And also we try to be as knowledgeable as possible, but I do not have access to training from the National Fair Housing Academy unless we are a FHAP. So if you wanted to call and ask me what would be the appropriate way for you to handle something, or for you to provide education for your tenants or your clients, I hopefully be very smart and provide you amazing answers. But at the same time, there are some limitations on I'm not allowed to register for these advanced training. So the fact that you would have folks you could come talk to directly would be an advantage to those on the call. And that's to everyone. Like I said, all residents, all housing providers, anyone like that, you'd be able to have those conversations. And that also includes, as Mr. Biggs said, that HUD does require a certain amount of trainings. Now for the NC Human Relations, they have some of those similar requirements. I don't know what the numbers look like comparatively, but of course they're doing those trainings across the state. So, if you wanted to get the training to know more about it, you might be traveling to Raleigh or Wilmington or something like that to participate in their trainings. Whereas we would be, since we are local, would be offering those trainings locally. And that could be coming to your specific office, or it could be offering a academy where we invite the local housing providers. At that point, I'll see it. Are there any more questions about tonight's process?
Another thing I was going to add to what you were saying, Race, you know, it's some assumptions one can make having been part of a FHAP agency. For those of you that, you know, haven't been able to see some of the things we see on the inside, it is fully expected, again, throughout that process, that you're fully transparent about what's going on. One thing that I was going to mention is that let's say there's a final determination that's made during an investigation, that's reviewed by the parties. So even before you make that final determination, anyone that's involved in that fair housing investigation will have the opportunity to say what they agree with or disagree with in your final determination. And it's our duty as investigators to work through that for as long as it may take in order to bring clarity to the situation. So there's not a situation where a result would happen that you didn't see coming at any point, even up until the final determination. That's a document that you produce for the parties to review. In that document, you're supposed to explicitly state the evidence that you've gathered throughout the investigation. So if any of those things are surprises to you, or you weren't aware, or you have questions about them, again, that investigator is supposed to be there to explain all of those elements.
Oh, we do have one more question. Mr. Crittlebaugh asks again, earlier you mentioned that you may be coming into property management agencies to see if they were in compliance. Can you give us more on that? It's important to understand that realtors are highly trained in fair housing. It's what we do. Mr. Big, do you want to respond to that?
Sure, and Mr. Crittlebaugh, please clarify if I'm going in the wrong direction with this. I'm not sure exactly what you mean that we'd be coming in to determine if they were compliant. I think what you may be referring to are the site visits. That's actually in response to a complaint. So there's not a situation where you know, a staff member from a FHAP agency will be coming in just to kind of roam around without some allegation or complaint that has already been assigned a case by HUD. You wouldn't be there unless you were responding to a specific complaint from a resident or tenant. So I'm not sure if I'm getting at what you may be referring to, but I hope that clarified it.
He clarified that did answer his question. And I'd only address the second thing, which is which I know that this is exactly what he meant, that we do understand that realtors are highly trained in fair housing, and that is why it was so important for us to ask you to be on this call, and all the other folks who are also on this call, you know, community leaders, you know, apartment association is also here, you know, housing coalition, housing authority. There are so many folks who do know fair housing, and absolutely this is an essential component of your job. I think that part of that is to ask, you know, kind of where do you get that training? So some of that could come from a local agency if a FHAP agency exists here. And the other thing is, just like anything else, you know, we fully believe that, you know, realtors and landlords and everybody is just like everybody else. Most people are in any field are doing great work, are, you know, assuming, you know, are highly competent, are doing the best they can, and all those things. And we know that as such, this is why fair housing complaints are rare. Just because they're rare doesn't mean they're not worth exploring, hence why this law exists. But we recognize that, you know, that's exactly what we would expect, that everybody is doing a great job, and that, as Mr. Biggs mentioned, while there are perhaps some, you know, a small portion of folks who are trying to skirt a law, just again, as there are in every single profession, that would be the rare exception. I think more often it is the, you know, an accidental thing, something that was a misunderstanding. And that's where this process is so much about conciliation and finding solutions that help further for fair housing, not punish. I think that that's really the goals of the program, is to make it fair. And the other thing which we emphasized at the beginning, but just to add in, is that this is also federal law. So this would not be, as Mr. Biggs emphasized, this would be a substantially equivalent. This would not be a new law. You wouldn't have to learn the new fair housing or something like that. Your expertise would be immediately transferable, because that would be the exact same laws that you're already operating under.
And one thing I was going to add to what Ray just mentioned, which is all exactly right. The housing provider perspective is one that's valuable to the FHAP agency as well. A lot is to be learned, can be learned from speaking with housing providers about what they see on the ground every day. So in any, local jurisdiction where there may be a FHAP agency, you would also expect to see a robust and healthy relationship with the Realtors Association, for example, and any other housing provider organization, because that's where you're going to meet the folks that need your assistance, that face these complex housing related questions every day. I've heard them. I've been peppered with those hypotheticals before, so I know that you guys are in many cases faced with some pretty difficult situations to deal with. And so, we understand that. And so that's why HUD mandates that you're an advisor of sort to those in your jurisdiction.
And Mr. Biggs, I don't see any further questions in the chat. I don't see any hands up. So I think this is a good time to close just real quick. So just to provide next steps as reminders, everybody, my office will be submitting we'll be sending out a summary of this that will include the YouTube link. So if you want to review this again, the summary will probably not be a point-by-point, sentence-by-sentence transcript. So especially it'll just highlight the big points, but we are going to try to include some timestamps of the archived copy. So if you want to go back and review a specific section, you'll have that option. And that should go out within the next 2 business days. So we're aiming for tomorrow. If for some reason we're unable to do that, we'll have it to you by Monday for sure. The next session will be next Thursday, and that will be again at 5:30. And that will be on the history of fair housing in High Point specifically. And we'll be talking about previous ordinances that have been passed, what those looked like, what those meant, and any actions that were taken by council. Everyone was able to get on today. Again, though, we are here to help you if you had trouble with Zoom links. We're also here to help with the process along the way. And if, as soon as we hang up the call today, you think of a question, please email me again at race.mccrae@highpointnc.gov. And I will be happy to provide answers. And then those will be read into the record live on our next meeting. So that way that all of this is documented and reviewable easily. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And we're going to end this meeting now.